We're gonna, hopefully my computer and Facebook will catch up with us. Jeffrey, thank you for joining us today. Could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background on this topic here?
Okay. So my name is Jeffrey Richardson. I thank you again, Dustin, and for the Sierra Club for making this opportunity possible. A little bit about my background. Well, I've worked as a community organizer, but in terms of, I have a degree in journalism and a degree in philosophy. I've worked as a professional journalist for a paper called the Pittsburgh Quarry, one of the largest, oldest African-American papers running in the country. And for me, I started off doing that work. I worked as a community organizer, trained in South Central Los Angeles in community organizing after working as a journalist, kind of an interesting twist and turn. Went out there, got training, worked on several campaigns, came back to Pittsburgh, worked with the organization in Pittsburgh, and we worked in issues related to housing, worked in issues related to police issues as well. And with the Jobs with Peace campaign, where I initially did my work as an organizer, we worked in a really big campaign in Los Angeles, collecting like 129,000 signatures, putting an initiative on the ballot, which was focused on reducing excessive and wasteful military spending. So after going through education, working as a journalist, I went into community organizing. And that had a big and profound impact on my life in terms of everything I do, basically, at this point in time. From there, working with the union, worked with SEIU as a labor organizer out in Los Angeles with a really large effort dealing with an African-American population of security officers, people who guard the buildings. If you go downtown, buildings who were severely underpaid. And the union was also housed with janitors who were largely Spanish speaking. So it was a really interesting experience in that LA arena. Did that for a number of years, came back. I worked in community economic development, which I think is really germane for this discussion. Worked in community economic development in Washington, D.C. for a group called the National Congress for Community Economic Development. And we worked with groups from around the country, helping to provide and identify resources. We had a big conference for groups that were working at the community level for job development, business development, et cetera. So those may be some experiences that are maybe germane. And I also do work in the solar industry and have a business with a social mission. But I think today's discussion, and I teach at the University of Delaware in Africana Studies, and I teach a course on environmental justice and a course on Black thought and philosophy. So, and I've worked in political campaigns and managed a campaign in the city of Pittsburgh. So a lot of different things. But I think for this discussion, I think the key thing is the work in community economic development. And in my own city, my hometown of Pittsburgh, I was on the board of a community development corporation. And then also after coming back from LA, hitting up the Jobs with Peace campaign chapter in Pittsburgh, we did a lot of initiatives there in the city involving lessons I learned in LA, precinct-based organizing, a lot of door-to-door work, training, education of community residents. We put an initiative on the ballot, actually, to ensure that women and quote-unquote minority, not a term I like to use much, but Black folks and other people of color, et cetera, would be given jobs in the city. We did that by way of a citizens-based initiative and put that on the ballot. And then we actually won it by, again, mobilizing people. And I'll talk more about that today, the importance of mobilizing people for this discussion. So that's a little bit about my own background. And that's pretty much it. And committed to this work of social, economic, racial justice. And in this particular discussion, we'll talk about community benefits agreement and how those are connected to those, some of my personal hopes, but also the larger work that has been done for many years around these issues.
Great, thanks. So for a number of people jump on. So for those just joining, we're live with Mr. Jeffrey Richardson here today. My name is Dustin Thompson. I'm the host for the day, and we're talking about community benefits agreement. If you're watching us on Facebook, a few people jump on. Please share. We appreciate you joining us today. So, Jeffrey, why don't you, it's always good to kind of define what we're talking about here. So, why don't you just give us kind of a little bit of a background or definition on community benefit agreements and maybe some examples of where they've been used successfully in the past.
Okay, so a community benefits agreement. I have actually some slides. Maybe we can go to that. I won't do a slide-heavy presentation, but I actually do have some slides that we can go through if you like and kind of talk about this. And maybe we can revert to that in a couple of minutes. But basically, a community benefits agreement is a legally enforceable contract signed by community groups and by a developer, and it sets forth a range of community benefits that the developer agrees to provide as part of a development project. Um, and maybe we can go to the site of the Delaware Community Benefits Agreement Coalition, which is the group I'm really representing today, the Delaware Community Benefits Agreement Coalition. So that definition, again, a community benefits agreement is a legally enforceable contract signed by community groups and the developer, setting forth a range of community benefits that the developer agrees to provide as part of a development project. And really, it's a negotiated process between that developer and other stakeholders, and organized representatives of impacted or affected communities. And essentially, what it works to do is to change the dynamics of the development process. And those dynamics essentially place developers aligned with potentially cities, governmental entities, financial entities, um, against the interests of communities. And essentially, the development process is structured in a way that it's highly imbalanced. And so community benefits agreements are a way to help to bring some balance back to that and to ensure that the interests of communities are embedded in and are part of the driving force for the shaping of the development process, whether that's a shopping mall or housing development or a port that's developed, et cetera, or a new business coming in that's going to have some impact potentially on a community.
So essentially, the developer and the community kind of sit down and talk about what the project entails, and the community kind of puts out, what they're looking for from the developer, and they form like a legal binding document, so to speak.
Exactly, that's the ideal, and that process involves developers and cities, elected officials. Um, Essentially, the way it typically works in the negative way is you have a development authority. Like in my hometown of Pittsburgh, we have something called the Urban Redevelopment Authority, which is a kind of quasi-governmental entity. Um, and they're accountable to the public, but then they're kind of outside of the control of the public, but they have an enormous amount of power. They can use eminent domain, they can take land, properties, etc. So in relationships like this, developers are aligned with these interests, and the political establishment, frequently cities, counties, governmental agencies, states, tend to align with the developers and then move processes forward. And that tends to leave out community residents, community organizations, neighborhood groups, church groups, community economic development entities, housing groups, et cetera, are off to the side. And the developers in the cities or state entities, they have the key discussions, they make the decisions, they set the framework, they set the guidelines, they make the decisions, and then tell people in communities this is what will be done. So that's a negative way of doing this, and that is the way that it typically takes place. But it should involve residents and communities, and all the entities I named. That would be in the ideal sense, unions, environmental groups, church groups, other community-based organizations, community economic development groups, neighborhood groups, housing groups, being part of the process. So if you had a triangle, it would involve the city, the developer, and those other stakeholders, right? So they'd all be involved together, communicating with each other and negotiating about how this development is going to take place, what the impacts are going to be on the community, and that the communities are participating in that so they can mitigate those potentially negative impacts and also move beyond that to shape it in a way that it's beneficial for the community in a real way. So there are specific benefits that are embedded in the process.
So what kind of projects, or maybe you can give some examples from past projects, have CBAs traditionally been a part of?
I'll use one here. And I was actually living in Los Angeles when some of this was happening. I went out there, I guess around 2001, too. But in 2001, you may know something called the Staples Center, where you see them playing basketball there in Los Angeles, right down outside of downtown. And in 2001, they had a broad coalition, and that coalition involved labor, community-based organizations, and this was to impact how they were going to expand the Los Angeles Staples Center. And what they were able to do through this negotiated process was to ensure that the developer funded assessment of a community park and recreational needs. They set a goal of 70% of the jobs created in the project. They would pay a living wage. There would be a first source hiring program. They would target job opportunities for low income individuals and those displaced by the project. This is an important point because many times when large developments are done, they actually displace the existing residents. And so they wanted to ensure that that was addressed as well. They increased a commitment to affordable housing, and the developer, they got funding for residential parking, and they also set standards for responsible contracting and leasing decisions by the developer. So this deals with issues of jobs, of hiring, of livable wage, of ensuring that even after development was done, that they also made sure that people had an opportunity to participate in that. So those are some of the things that were done at the Staples Center. And it's critical that in decisions like this, ideally that these discussions take place before the development is done, is completed, because once it's completed and everything's signed, it's much more challenging to get these things to happen. And the leverage of communities is strongest before all the documents are signed, because that developer wants to get this land or get this project moving. The city wants to get it going because they're looking at tax revenue. That's a big driver for the interests of whether it's a state, a county, or city tax revenue. And that the communities have leverage at that point to press to get some things in these agreements to, again, mitigate negative impacts and to expand and or create positive impacts for communities when the development process takes place.
So, you and I were discussing a little bit kind of the moment that we're in right now in the United States before we started the call.
Mm-hmm.
Why would you say that the community benefits agreements, the CBAs, are really important in that context of kind of where we're at in the U.S. right now?
Thank you. Yeah, I think it's critical because, looking at economic development, and CBAs are kind of like an economic development tool to address the current economic development process. We'll talk a little bit more about that. But in the current moment, as we look at the history of the country, and this moment is actually kind of a reckoning for many issues that have not been addressed in this country. If we talk about issues of inequality, issues of displacement, starting with the indigenous people in this country. And one of the things is issues of race and racism, and I'll talk specifically about anti-Black racism in America and how it has been a very powerful tool to push forward some of the most reactionary elements of the politics of this country. And we can see that being played out in this country right in Washington, D.C. now, where some of the most reactionary elements of this nation now pushing this country towards basically towards fascism, if you will. And we are at the point now where we're walking on this thin line where the country has to address the issues that it has not addressed, the inequality, and begin to hopefully move towards democracy, a fuller democracy, a real democracy, and that we deconstruct the mythology, the lies of what America is, and begin to construct something new, something that America can be, that we can all be proud of. And we're far from that. But to get there, we need people to be engaged. For this specific discussion, when we look at the economic development aspect of that, because we're looking at a whole system, if you look at residential housing patterns, just to go back a little bit, that's a key aspect of how development takes place and has taken place. Once laws were put in place, again, laws supported by the government, policies of government, cities across the country to segregate communities, it made it easier to target particularly low-income people of color communities, and I'll stay specifically in Black communities in this instance. And so development was typically done against these communities, like putting a freeway through communities. That was development. And that's been done in many cities across the country, many times through Black communities. We can see that right here in Wilmington, 95, boom, right through communities, splitting those communities. In my city of Pittsburgh, development in downtown blew up something. They built something called the Civic Arena. It blew up the Black community there and dispersed the Black community all throughout. And it never really recovered significantly from that. And you can find patterns like this across the country. Highly racialized, highly exploitive, and then they set into motion patterns that lock in segregation that leads to segregated schools, segregated housing, and it also leads to the segregated thinking around policies related to development and who benefits and who does not. So some communities get all types of development, stores, shopping centers, malls, food, access, and some communities get almost nothing. Or they have developments that are placed there that sometimes other people don't want. That's one thing that happens as well. And we can talk about those. Or development is done in a way, it's done essentially over those communities without them having almost any say at all. And community benefits agreements have been organized to help to put a halt to that and to open the process up for participation by communities so that they have a say in the process and development that will impact their lives in many instances for decades to come.
So I appreciate that. I think with any issue, you do have to look at the historical context of what you're dealing with, and not just acknowledge that, but think about, are the policies that you're pushing for going to help that or going to make it worse? And a lot of times we kind of think in terms of, well, it maybe doesn't impact it one way or the other, which is honestly seldom the case. Policies generally can make matters much, much worse with unintended consequences, or they can work towards social justice and environmental justice and help things out. So when I think as community organizers, this is something that we got to think about all the time. Anytime we're organizing around policies, I think we got to think about, not only what are we pushing for, but who's doing the pushing. Are we centering communities? Are we doing like what a CBA does? Are we centering the needs and the voices of the communities that are impacted? Or are we just kind of pushing for stuff without taking a look and reflection on that, on who we're centering in our work? I know Sierra Club has definitely done some reckoning on with that issue, with some of the issues we've had in the past, and you're never done, right? Like it's always a work that you have to continuously do. And I just gotta to shout out to you and people like Larry who frequently help drive that conversation of community ownership of the issues. Representative Lambert, when I say Larry, I mean Representative Lambert, but you two have, and all the organizing I think that you guys do, that's the central tenet. And I just I admire it so much that you guys can do it so graciously and so well. And I'm sure there's tons of other people out there that do that too, but I work with you guys a lot, and I appreciate that work that you do. So on CBAs, what are kind of like, so we talked a little bit about the process a little bit, but in terms of kind of digging down just a little bit further into under the surface of this, what are some of kind of the legal benefits that come with having a CBA versus just having kind of maybe an oral contract or a quote understanding?
So I think the key thing is that it's a legally binding contract. And that's the thing that makes a community benefits agreement different than a city saying, we want to do the right thing for communities, or making proclamations, or saying that we are concerned about communities, or we hope that this will benefit, or we believe that this is going to happen. I mean, that's very nice. It's good for PR purposes, but that doesn't have enforcement power. And a community benefits agreement actually is legal. It's binding. It's a contract, and it's enforceable. So that when we talk about issues of employment, that's enforceable. So there's some specific goals that are set, and that's another thing, having very clearly articulated goals. Who's going to get jobs? So they're talking about sourcing of jobs. They're talking about a certain percentage hired from various communities that are local and that will be impacted. Not saying we're going to employ thousands of people, but where are they going to be employed from? That has to be written in and baked in, because you could have a development right next to a community, low-income people of color community. The development takes place. They say they're going to hire people, but they hire people from outside, or mostly even from another state, so that those communities at one level now have to bear the brunt of a development that will not benefit them, the negative impacts of the development that could lead to air pollution, health issues, noise issues, etc. And then they don't even get jobs in it on top of that. So they get all of the negative and none of the positives. So that has to be written in. So it's an enforceable contract, so that it involves lawyers sitting down. There's lawyers with developers, city, etc., and community groups sitting down and actually getting this into the contract. And that will be binding. And that when they throw out numbers like employment, many times when developers want to do a project, they'll throw out these huge numbers. Now that's going to play well with the elected officials, but it's going to say, hey, we're going to get money for our residents, our constituents. And then the city is going to say, or the state, county, whatever, we're going to get tax revenue. That's great. But frequently, that does not happen. The numbers are blown up. It's part of the sales phase of this. They get the city locked in. The city starts giving them highly subsidized projects, which they take tax dollars from residents, taxpayers, give it to the developers with tax incentives, tax breaks. So the public is subsidizing it. The developer makes huge promises of all the jobs they're going to bring, and then they get the money. Now that's just done on having a PR firm put together the presentation slide decks, and they give them the money. Unfortunately, if there's no CBA, if there's nothing documented there, and if it's not a legally binding contract, what we see happen is once they get the project, we were talking 5,000 jobs. Well, they only produce 1,500 jobs. Well, that's a big difference. 1,500 jobs is great, but that's a 5,000. We're down to 1,500. But we gave you tax breaks of millions and millions of dollars on the hopes that this will happen. And then the developer says, oh, we had a couple bad years. This happened, that happened, and that doesn't occur. And then they were going to employ people. Well, they didn't have it baked in that they would hire local people. So they are bringing 1,500 people in, far from 5,000, really bad. But then out of the 1,500, most of those people come from somewhere else. That wasn't baked in. So those are the things I think that are critical. That it's legally binding, that the specifics are baked in, they're negotiated, and that the communities participate in that. And that these arrangements vary from project to project. There's some generalities that connect all of them, but a different community may have different needs. All right. So one community on one side of town, they may say, we want to have, if this development is going to come here, we want to make sure that there's specific guidelines around stopping displacement of existing residents, and that there has to be either funding or building of new housing, et cetera, to address those issues. And that has to be written in, and that economic commitment has to be part of that contract as well.
So have you seen any challenges brought about by the communities that have had these CBAs and the companies didn't stick to their word?
We actually had one right here, just a group that was dealing with the compost work here in Delaware, and they did have a community agreement, but the company basically kind of didn't address the issues of keeping compost from smelling, right? They had this big facility where they were using that, and they developed an agreement here. This is a local one, and I guess for a while it worked, but the company did not follow through, and they eventually, from complaints from people from the odors and smells, they got it shut down. And so those are some of the things that happened. I can see also there's one that took place in Baltimore for a major development going around Baltimore, around the harbor. One of the things about that, as I looked through some of the information related to it, a lot of it was based upon these very detailed numbers that the developer put together about how they would pay out money that they committed to pay out based upon their profitability, this, that, and the other. And so, lo and behold, once they get their money and they get the development, somehow the numbers didn't work out. And so the communities weren't getting what they were supposed to get. So really it was kind of messed up. But that's after the fact. So now they're kind of stuck. So I think things like that have to be really detailed. And again, communities would need attorneys to help with those kind of things, and then begin to put pressure back on the um, the entities that don't follow through. There's a group out in Los Angeles, Harbor Community Benefits Foundation. This came out of a similar arrangement where the port was going to be expanded in LA. They didn't want to address the community benefits needs of the people in the communities. After negotiations, this took a number of years, they actually had to file a lawsuit at that point. And they actually won the lawsuit, and they got some millions of dollars to set up a community benefit foundation where they now give money to support mitigation of pollution and other things around that port. And they have community residents sitting on that along with elected officials as well. And so that is one of the ways that this can be addressed. Hopefully you can have negotiations in the ideal world. We all sit down together, we're all stakeholders, community residents, labor unions, church groups, the developers, the city, elected officials, financial entities, and we negotiate what is going to be the best way to do this that mitigates negative impacts and that works best for everybody. And that community residents are say, okay, this looks like this will be a reasonable development. We've helped to address to the greatest extent that we can in a way that we can live with that this development will move forward. And in the best case, we find that now we're going to get some real benefits. That school that's been abandoned, they're going to take it over and do that. There's housing that's needed. They're going to put some monies into helping to develop housing. They're going to put money into community-based entities that are doing work so they help to strengthen the local economy. They're going to source some of their materials and maybe help to build up a supply store in a community by giving them some orders and help to build their capacity to strengthen the local economy. So those things have to be written in really directly. They're going to bank with, say if there's a Black-owned bank, for instance, in the community, or a credit union, or we have the Banking Desert Initiative that's done all the great work. Maybe they support issues like that. So it's ways for communities to look at how do we get this development to work for us and not work against us. And in the ideal sense, we get the agreement. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot of environmental and social justice issues in Delaware. I mean, we're talking about expanding the port, which is in an area that already has a number of EJ and social issues that from years of frankly bad policies and just systemic racism in our county. And then you have, downstate where they're talking about bringing in, a huge biogas anaerobic digestion facility and possibly doing, infinitely more spray irrigation, which is poisoning people's wells down there. Even bringing in waste from out of state to handle and spray in Delaware. And I mean, just a lot of, we're already in a situation in so many areas where, I mean, you have people that for now going on 5 years, 6 years, haven't been able to drink their water, Sussex County. And it just seems like there's a lot of issues already percolating to the point where it's going to boil over. So how can we use CBAs? What are the resources available maybe to utilize CBAs to help mitigate some of these issues and push back against kind of that overrunning interests of industry over running over the interests of the community?
I think those examples you gave are great. And I want to keep coming back to the idea of organizing and all the literature that I've read and then what I've participated in directly, whether it was in LA or in Pittsburgh. Um, Community participation is key, and forming effective coalitions is key. Even if you have good legal frameworks put together and a good agreement, if there's no one there to keep an eye on that, and believe me, once something like that is done, citizens have to keep their eye on it. Because if that is not done, then things kind of happen. And someone said, well, you didn't know we were supposed to do this, and it doesn't get done. So community organizing, I think, is essential. And I think that's, in most of the literature I've read, is that's key. And in efforts, again, working in Pittsburgh and ballot initiatives, et cetera, the mobilization of people to do education, to do outreach, to register people to vote, to get initiative on the ballot, to do education and then win it at the ballot, the enforcement of it, the constant vigilance on that has to be done on a consistent basis. So organizing is the key. And the environmental issues that you raise are part definitely of the development process. And obviously some of these are coming more to the fore, whether we talk about the port and PCBs and dioxins being dug out when they work to expand that, or if we look at down south, as you mentioned, people working in the chicken facilities down there. These environmental issues are and should be part of the framework of discussions of a community benefits agreement, because these might be called legacy pollutants. There's issues of cumulative impact. Communities are already burdened with environmental problems that have caused cancers and asthma and emphysema, and this is going on, as you mentioned, pollution of water, and it's not a little problem. We, in my work at the university, we brought in Gina Lester, who's from Flint, Michigan, right, where they have obviously a poisoning of a predominantly Black city. And almost nothing was done for a while. Eventually, it took years for them to get any really justice on that. My own hometown in Pittsburgh, we have problems with the water. They're talking about doing fracking, right? Again, this is a business interest, fracking, and we have some problems there already. And here we have the same dynamics. So what we see is, and we have a long history, as you mentioned, we have companies like DuPont. Certainly they've done things and built schools, but this is one of the largest companies of its kind in the world. Their legacy of pollutant is global in perspective. And the water systems in our state have been poisoned by this. People actually, once we get more information out, I think people understand that this is not a little thing. The aspects of basic life are impacted by development, the development process, and a runaway focused commitment, almost a religious adherence to the will and dictates of developers and corporations over against the interest, the health, the safety of communities. And that's really what we're talking about. And CBAs are one of the ways to address that by way of developing agreements and interceding in that process and working to open it up so that residents are at the table and have a say. It's something that has to be demanded. The ideal would be it's a friendly process, and we hope that's the ideal. You hope that you can just start off and people will get it. Hey, you're a corporation, you're coming in, you're going to do this development. People live here, they're going to be impacted. We should be able to sit down together. That's in the friendly phase. You hope that happens, but sometimes it doesn't. So then one group there to do a lawsuit, and then it lead to another escalation of community pressure, signature gathering, letter writing, picketing, whatever needs to be done to get this to stop. Because when it gets to these issues of health, these are not small things. You're talking about cancers. You're talking about people who will die from these. Or you're talking about squeezing communities by development. That means that people have to leave their communities. And typically they don't get enough money to get a house that will replace the replacement value for their homes. So you basically destroyed a community with so-called development. And so the definition of development and what we call economic development, communities have to take a role in defining what that means for them and not just have people come in and say, well, this is development. Is it development? If you destroy communities, how do you also have development? That's, to me, those things cannot cohere. They cannot exist together.
So, the Sierra Club recently, last year, towards the end of the year, officially joined the Community Benefit Agreement Coalition here in Delaware. Happy to be aboard and supportive of you guys' work. So, if you could, could you tell everybody a little bit about the coalition here in Delaware? And I know there's a lot of work being done right now. So, if you could kind of give us some layout of that.
Well, again, thank you, Sierra Club, Delaware, for your great support. Dustin, you've been out there doing it. So we're glad that you're a part, and we're really thankful for all the work that you've done. So we are working to address issues at the port. We were formed essentially to address the development of community benefits agreements across the state, to be a source of information about community benefits agreements and how people can participate and utilize these as a vehicle to protect their interests and to, in the best case, develop friendly, collaborative relationships with development entities in their communities. And then looking at a whole spectrum of steps that can be done to improve this process for communities. We are focusing, as one of our specific focuses, not the sole one, is the port. It's a very large project, probably one of the largest projects in the state at this point in time. The port will be expanded in Wilmington. Diamond State Port Corporation, they basically have about a 50-year agreement where they'll be kind of operating the port. That's going to bring tax revenue into the state. It's going to provide jobs. And as we are very supportive of the development of jobs, right? So we're not against that at all. But we are concerned about some of the significant environmental impacts that this will have. So there'll be environmental impacts. Again, I mentioned things like PCBs and dioxin, other chemicals in the water, right? When they expand the port to make it possible for bigger ships to come in to bring in a larger volume of cargo, that's going to have an environmental impact. There's going to be an increase in truck traffic, an exponential increase, and that's by plan because they want to have more cargo coming in, more cargo going out of there, more trucks coming in, which means more diesel, which means more pollution, which means more impacts on communities surrounding it. In addition to that, there also will be what they call off-port development. When a port like this develops, one of the plans is to get more businesses to come who want to work and be connected to the port. Well, that means another expansion. So at this point in time, there is no process in place to address almost any of these issues. In addition to that, for the communities, there's no plan to halt displacement or to address potential displacement. So on one level, people want to push forward directly for the expansion, to make it a larger port, to bring in more money, more tax revenue, more jobs. On the other hand, communities certainly want jobs, but don't want pollution. Dioxins are some of the most toxic substances that we've created. You don't want to have any possibility of that being released and potentially impacting people. The huge increase in diesel fuel and the air quality degradation is a major concern. That has not been significantly mitigated or addressed at this point in time. And then the off-port impacts in terms of the expansion and what it's going to do to those communities. We are focused on these issues, and we are working to get a community benefits agreement in place that addresses these issues, that there are mitigation steps baked into a document, and that is a legally binding, enforceable document to help to make sure that as this development takes place, that it does not negatively impact communities. And so here we're trying to achieve a goal where we can get the benefit of development and also that the communities are partners in that, and that the development does not have negative impacts. So that's kind of where we are with that right now. And so, go ahead, I'm sorry.
I was just going to say, so how could a CBA kind of be drafted or formulated to, help prevent or mitigate some of these issues? Maybe perhaps you could give us some examples, CBAs with other port agreements, or just some examples of what could be, not necessarily specifically what you're arguing for, although if you have that too, that'd be great. But just some examples of what could possibly be included.
Oh, okay. Gee whiz. Um, for the port, things like, and there's some specific things, and I'll talk about in general, like jobs. Who gets the jobs? And this is something that might happen in almost any of these developments, like Staples Center or LAX, um, which is the airport in LA, or the Baltimore port when they expanded. How many jobs and who actually gets the jobs? Because there's been a lot of big numbers about jobs. But the question is, who actually gets the jobs?
Right.
How
Are
many
they coming from another state? Are they coming from Jersey? Or are they actually coming from the communities in the area?
Exactly. And we know that there'll be people who are employed in Wilmington, but also how many people from specifically the impacted communities that ring the port itself, that is addressed in really very specific terms. Because we've heard discussion about, well, there's some jobs that will be open, and then there's other jobs that are like professional jobs. And those professional jobs, those seem to be ones that are going to be bring people from the outside in, and they tend to have higher salaries as well. So we got to deal with the whole spectrum of those jobs. As an example, so early on in this is several years ago, they had a consultant come in who put together the packages they were going to then use to make the case to the state and other elected officials to move this port forward. That contract that consultant got was about $500,000. So that contract, as far as we understand, as far as I understand at this point in time, there wasn't like a big competitive process. I'm sure there may be some consultants in the city of Wilmington who could have done that. But the group, I think, came out of New York that did that. That's not even something related specifically to the port, but that's just one other area. And they do other types of goods and services that they utilize. How are those going to be addressed in terms of the benefits to communities and potential business development? Also, investments around local community needs. A community assesses its needs, and then in these discussions with this port or a big entity says, how do we get some of these issues addressed? Because you're going to make an incredible amount of money, right? And you're going to impact our lives in a significant way for years and years to come. There has to be a trade-off, and we need to have some things done in our communities, whether it's housing, whether renovation of school, whether it's support, some funds going into support maybe a community financial institution that will then provide income for residents to do and start businesses even. So there's a lot of things that could be done. And from that perspective, fairly creative, but things that are fairly consistent are like jobs and who gets the jobs. And
So it doesn't always have to necessarily be specifically tied to, like, so jobs is specifically tied to the port, right? The port's creating jobs. You want X number of the high paying jobs, not just the lower wage of the jobs available to the community members, guaranteed to the community members that are being impacted. So that's kind of directly tied to the port, right? Port's creating jobs. You want some of those jobs reserved, right?
Yep.
But they could be, as you just said, kind of more of a creative aspect and indirect ties, right? So, all right, you're coming into the community and you're over here in this part of the community, but over here, we have a community center that needs some love, right? Needs some renovation, needs some updates, need to improve the overall living conditions. So you can offset some of your, truck traffic impacts, right? Where you're not able to necessarily require that, every truck that comes through is an EV truck, right? And just cut those emissions out. We know you can't do that, but if you would improve our quality of life by renovating this community center, we would consider that an offset. So it can kind of be indirectly related to the project as well, I guess.
Yes, definitely. And even with the trucks, one of the things that can be done is things like mitigation and impacting and supporting health entities in communities around testing and ongoing monitoring of these facilities that there's funds for the community to do that independently. Because one of the challenges is that you have a big entity that has political connections throughout the state, if not at the highest levels of government. Because to get a port agreement like we have here, this is an international arrangement, because you have the entity is actually from United Arab Emirates. So for that to happen, you have to have the highest levels of the national government to approve of a port, with an entity from another nation. So we want to make sure that things are monitored and that the monitoring also is done independently. And maybe request to get funds put aside so that it's done by an independent entity. So the, you have all these trucks coming through, air quality is tested. And this has happened in the past where people are saying, man, this doesn't feel good. Something's not right here with the air. But then they get a test and the test says it's fine. Well, maybe there's resources going to independent entities that do the testing that are connected to communities. So that may be another way to help to address the mitigation. And then the enforcement. When you have trucks and when they're running a lot of trucks through there, they're making money, more and more trucks. But maybe trucks are idling in communities and they said, we won't do that, but they are doing it. We got pictures of them doing it just yesterday or something like that, that there's ways to enforce that. So those are other things that can be done, and have resources put aside to help groups do that. And maybe there's entities set up of multiple community organizations and even some entities from the elected officials, et cetera, but that it's not just them, that there's independent testing going on to ensure that the things that are agreed to are followed through on.
Right
So
on.
there's a host of things that can be done with the community benefits agreement.
So I did put our, your homepage, our homepage, however we want to phrase that, for the Community Benefits Coalition in the chat. I put it in our comments as well. So I hope everybody checks it out. A lot of good resources there. And yeah, Casey, I see your question, and I'm going to ask it. And I just want to remind anybody else, if you have questions, now is the time, because I'm going to ask this one, and then I'm going to kind of ask Jeffrey to give us some information about how people can get connected with him. But so Casey's asking, what policies could be implemented on the state level to encourage, require, or support the use of CBAs? And I want to add on to that a little bit to ask, are there any jurisdictions that actually that already require a CBA for any specific type of development?
Oh, okay. So I'll start with yours first. Required. Now that I have to do some research on. I know that there are multiple CBAs, and I should know this, but I'll check on that, whether there are state regulations that require CBAs. The thing about it is, we have all these agreements in place, and there actually are federal laws in place. This is the other part why, for all this to work, it is absolutely essential that communities are organized and mobilized. Because even if we just use the port as an example, there's federal guidelines in place now, and they're supposed to have public hearings now. At least even Denver, they have public hearings. All this, there's supposed to be all this community participation stuff that goes on. If you talk to officials of government, you would think that we have a very robust regimen of participation, but it doesn't happen. So I would say on one level, there are some laws existing now that should govern how these processes are done. Like they have public hearings, people are supposed to be able to have participation. And when they want to get the money, they all reference that we had 2 public hearings, and then the people came, we heard what they said, and so now give us the money so we can do what we want to do. So they check all the boxes. So we have to hold them accountable and make this much more in depth. In terms of at the state level, and because each of these agreements will be different depending upon the community and its specific needs, that's one part. I don't know that you could do that at the state level because there's a level of specific detail. However, general levels of maybe having it be written in that it's a guideline that for any major developments, and then we have to define what major developments, what that is. Is it a certain dollar amount, is it a certain size? We can kind of have to think that through. But that the community participation component is strengthened, and that it is mandated that before major permits are signed off on or approved, that there has to be a robust, enhanced community participation process. And maybe that has to be spelled out more, where key players are involved before. And then it would be like a checkoff of multiple meetings, et cetera, that need to take place before the letting loose of public dollars to support developments that could potentially have some adverse impact on communities. So
Or
that's my,
I don't, yeah. No, I hear what you're saying, but even, I don't care if there's public money or not going into it, it should happen, right? Like it should,
oh yeah, I agree
you
with
look
that.
at New Jersey's, recently passed cumulative impact legislation, right? I mean, you're talking about, here's the X industries that we're worried about. Here's the X communities that we're talking about that are being taken advantage of hand over fist. And here's the participation process that you have to go through. And it's very specifically delineated. We need to do something like that here in Delaware. And hopefully we'll have more to talk about with that, in a future day. But so how can someone get involved? Casey just asked if that legislation was called. So it's actually New Jersey's cumulative impact assessment legislation, which was passed I believe in October of last year. Casey, or if anybody who's interested in seeing that, I do have the link to that. I'm not on hand though. So if you want to email me, my email is just my first and last name at sierraclub.org. So Dustin.Thompson at sierraclub.org, and I'll get you the link to that. Because I have it straight from the Jersey, legislative website that I can forward it to you. But anyway, so how could someone get involved or learn more about CBAs and the coalition and the great work that it's doing?
They can get in touch at, actually they can write at info@delcba.org. Del, it's an info at delcbac.org. Or you can go to delcbac.org is the website, delcbac.org, or info@delcbac.
Yeah.
Right.
I'm putting that. Sorry, I'm putting that in the.
Let me
here. So you guys have a contact us form on the page as well.
exactly.
So you can always utilize that. For those that are chugging along here at home on the Zoom, it's there in the chat. I'll put it in the Facebook comments here as well.
Yes.
If anybody is wanting to reach out.
delcbac.org and info@delcbac.org. So the other thing that I can real quickly is that in relationship to this, because I have all this stuff in front of me, I didn't think to use it. This is right in my own city. Having the establishment of a steering committee, this is critical because this gets back to this idea about the stakeholders. And this is something that could be written in. This is in many of these agreements, that there is a stakeholders or a steering committee that's composed of community residents plus the developer and other entities that has to meet regularly to assess how the development process takes place. And even after the development takes place, that there are meetings at some regular intervals where communities interface to assess that it is actually being done correctly. So that's one thing that I think could be in almost all of these agreements. And then in addition to the things that are specific to like what dollar amounts will be coming in, or what type of funds might be set up, or is it going to be housing that they're going to invest in? Is it going to be jobs? Is it going to be mitigation of potential environmental impacts, et cetera? But that the residents that is written into these agreements, that they must meet with community residents, that there's a standing entity that they meet with both prior to the approval of any permits and after it is established, that there's consistent meetings regularized where that same enforceable contract is in place. And that means that after the project is done, they don't get to just say, okay, now you people in the community get out of here. No, we're here for the long haul. So that's something that I think that would be important to have done at the state level. And it's really a critical part of, I think, a successful community benefits agreement as well.
Sorry, I muted myself. Great. So we are at the top of the hour here. I think we've had a great discussion. I appreciate everybody. We've had some people watching on Facebook the whole time. I appreciate everybody who's joined us on the Zoom, has been following along. Jeffrey, always appreciate you and the great work that you do, and EJ and renewable energy and God knows everything else. So those who are still watching, if you're unaware, the legislature just filed the RPS legislation, Renewable Portfolio Standard legislation, SB 33. You can check out on our website, sierraclub.org/Delaware. We have an updated action where you can send a letter to your legislators and let them know that you want them to support that bill and move towards a 50% goal for renewable energy here in Delaware. It's something, Jeffrey, you and I have been working on. Hopefully we'll get our community solar bill passed this year too, and a bunch of other stuff. Hopefully 2021 is gonna be a good year for the environment here in Delaware. So I appreciate your help on all these things.
Well, thank you, Dustin. Thank you, Sierra Club. Thank you for all the members of the Delaware Community Benefits Agreement Coalition, all of your support and all the work that people are doing, and all the participants on this call. We got to do this together. That's the other thing, is it's a coalition. It's not a person, one person. We need individuals certainly, but it's a coalition, and we need the power of people coming together. That is something that is essential for something like this to work. People coming together.
So if you're out there and you're watching and you're part of another organization, make sure that you reach out and join the coalition. Info at delcbac.org and tell them Jeffrey sent.
All right, cool. Thanks.
All right, Jeff.
All right.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks so much. All right, appreciate it.